August 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The air was thick with humidity and the bitter smell of burned fuel. Smoke drifted low over the jungle clearing where palm trees stood shattered like matchsticks. In the muddy clearing below, U.S. Marines moved slowly between the wrecks. Rifles raised, boots sinking into the black water pooled in the tank tracks. One vehicle drew their attention. It was small, almost fragile. A squat, sand-colored tank half buried in the muck. Its turret twisted open like a tin can. Steam still hissed from a cracked engine block. The metal, thin as roofing sheet, had folded under the impact of a 37mm shell. A Marine corporal rapped his knuckles against the torn armor. The sound was hollow, almost laughable. "This is it?" he muttered. Around him, others grinned in disbelief. They had spent nights under Japanese shell fire, and now saw what kind of armor their enemy had sent against them. The wrecked tank was a Type 95 Heigo, Japan's most common light tank, and to the Marines, it looked more like a toy than a weapon of war. The question lingered. How had Japan expected to win with this? To understand why the U.S. Marines were so astonished by what they found on Guadalcanal, we must step back to a time when Japan believed light armor would conquer Asia. In the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army was not preparing to fight the United States. Its eyes were fixed on China, a land of vast distances, poor infrastructure, and outdated weaponry. Here, mobility mattered more than armor, and machine guns often ruled the battlefield. In this environment, Japan's tank designers followed a simple doctrine: build fast, build light, and build many. The result was the Type 95 Heigo. Introduced in 1935, weighing barely 7 tons, it was armed with a 37mm Type 94 main gun and two 7.7mm machine guns. Its armor, as thin as 6mm on some surfaces, could deflect rifle fire but not much else. It carried a crew of 3, commander, gunner, and driver. For its time, it was agile and reliable, powered by an air-cooled diesel engine that performed well in tropical climates. In China and early campaigns in Southeast Asia, the Heigo served effectively. Against poorly equipped Chinese forces and lightly armed colonial troops, its speed and simplicity gave Japan an edge. But success bred complacency. By the late 1930s, the world was changing fast. Tanks were getting bigger, guns heavier, armor thicker. Japan, isolated and confident, continued to produce the same design with minor improvements. When the Pacific War began in 1941, the Japanese army still believed its light tanks could dominate in the jungles and islands of the Pacific. Strategists reasoned that heavy armor would be useless on soft ground or narrow roads. Instead, they focused on maneuver warfare. Light tanks supporting infantry, not independent armored thrusts. It was a doctrine that made sense on paper, but by the time Japan faced American forces, it was already outdated. The United States had entered the war with powerful industrial capacity and modern armored designs. Even the early M3 Stuart light tank, with its thicker armor and superior optics, could outmatch the Type 95 in every category except fuel efficiency. By the time the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they were expecting fierce infantry resistance, not tank battles. When Japanese Type 95s finally appeared, clattering out of the tree line in the humid night, the Americans were both shocked and unimpressed. They were witnessing the collision of two eras: the lightweight optimism of 1930s Japan meeting the steel and precision of 1940s America. And soon, that clash would unfold violently in the mud of the Lunga perimeter. When the U.S. Marines came ashore on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they entered a battlefield unlike any other in history. One where heat, disease, and exhaustion were as deadly as bullets. Their mission was to capture and hold the island's unfinished Japanese airfield, later named Henderson Field. a strip of coral and crushed grass that would soon decide the fate of the Pacific. For weeks, the Marines fought off night attacks, air raids, and artillery fire. But what they hadn't yet seen were Japanese tanks. Most believed the terrain was too hostile, too thick, too soft for armored warfare. Yet the Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade, part of the Ichiki Detachment, believed otherwise. In mid-August, Japanese commanders decided to test their enemy's defenses with armor. They deployed 9 Type 95 Heigo light tanks from the 1st Company, 1st Independent Tank Battalion. Their goal was audacious: break through Marine lines near the Ilu River, known to the Marines as the Tenaru, and reclaim Henderson Field in a single thrust. The Japanese crews prepared for battle in silence. They had never faced American tanks before, and certainly not Marine 37mm anti-tank guns dug in behind coconut log barriers. Many of the tankers still believed the same myths that had served them well in China, that courage, surprise, and speed would overcome any obstacle. But what awaited them was industrial reality. The Marines had positioned their M3 37mm anti-tank guns along the river crossing, camouflaged and sighted perfectly. When the Type 95s appeared in the pale moonlight, their engines whined and their riveted hulls rattled like thin tin. The Marines watched quietly through iron sights, waiting until the lead tank crossed into the open. Then, with one synchronized volley, they fired. The first shell punched clean through the Type 95's frontal plate, igniting its fuel tank. A second round struck another tank's turret ring, blowing it open like a metal flower. The night erupted with fire. Japanese infantry behind the tanks froze, shocked by the sudden violence. Within minutes, 7 of the 9 tanks were burning. The rest tried to retreat but bogged down in the sand or were picked off one by one. The Japanese infantry, left without their armored support, charged desperately into Marine machine gun fire. By dawn, the attack had collapsed completely. When morning came, the battlefield was silent, except for the crackle of burning steel. Marines cautiously moved forward to inspect the wrecks. What they found astonished them. The Type 95s were smaller than expected, almost half the height of an American Sherman. Their armor was paper-thin, easily pierced, even by rifle-caliber armor-piercing rounds. The interiors were cramped and poorly ventilated, the optics crude, and the turret mechanism stiff and unreliable. As one Marine later recalled, it was hard to believe men had fought inside those things. That morning, laughter echoed across the captured field as Marines banged on the thin plates and compared them to farm equipment back home. They weren't mocking the bravery of their enemy, only the futility of the machine itself. The Type 95s had rolled into battle carrying the hopes of an empire and ended up as burnt-out relics of a bygone war. Philosophy. But to truly understand why this moment mattered, we must look deeper at the human and technological angles that defined it. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the wreckage of the Type 95 Heigo was more than just a battlefield curiosity. It was a glimpse into the mindset of the enemy they were fighting. Most of these Marines had never seen a Japanese tank before. Many were farm boys, mechanics, or laborers back home. They knew steel, engines, and machinery. So when they examined the remains of the Heigo, they viewed it through the eyes of men who understood craftsmanship. The first thing they noticed was its fragility. The armor plates were barely thicker than the body of a car. Rivets, instead of welds, held the structure together, an outdated method that caused deadly spalling when hit by enemy fire. Inside, the crew space was suffocatingly small, its controls primitive. There was no real fire suppression system, no radio, no comfort of any kind. The Marines were stunned. How had an empire capable of building aircraft like the Zero relied on tanks like this? In the days that followed, captured Japanese prisoners revealed part of the answer. For Japanese tank crews, Survival was never the goal. Success was. Their training emphasized discipline and sacrifice over mechanical advantage. They were taught that morale and aggression could compensate for inferior technology. To the Americans, this was almost incomprehensible. In U.S. doctrine, a soldier's life was worth protecting through innovation. Thicker armor, better communication, safer engineering. The Japanese approach was the opposite. Faith in spirit over steel. At Henderson Field, that contrast was visible in the wreckage. Marines pulled out burned helmets, melted instruments, and even personal items from the charred interiors. Photographs, letters, and small flags bearing the rising sun and handwritten prayers. For a moment, the laughter stopped. The men realized these tanks weren't symbols of incompetence. They were symbols of human devotion forced into a hopeless fight. One Marine mechanic wrote in his field diary, "They fought hard with what they had, but it wasn't enough. Their tank was a coffin before it even started its engine." That observation captured the essence of the Pacific War's human paradox, the bravery of Japanese soldiers trapped inside, machines that could never save them, and the ingenuity of American soldiers armed with tools that constantly evolved. It was a war between courage and capability. And, on Guadalcanal, capability had won. But there was another story hidden beneath those thin steel plates. The story of design philosophy and technological doctrine that led Japan down this path. The Type 95. Heigo was not born out of carelessness. It was the product of a deliberate, if misguided, doctrine. When Japanese engineers first sketched its design in the early 1930s, they were following orders that reflected Japan's strategic priorities: light, fast, and cheap to build. The empire's wars in China demanded mobility, not protection. The Hago fit that demand perfectly. A small tank that could cross rice fields, climb slopes, and outpace infantry columns. In that environment, the design worked. The Hago could move up to 45 kilometers per hour and travel over 150 kilometers on a single tank of diesel. Impressive for its time. Its 37mm gun was deadly against unarmored targets, and its diesel engine reduced the risk of fire compared to gasoline models used in Western armies. But technology is defined by context. By 1942, the world had changed. Tanks were no longer infantry support tools. They were the backbone of modern warfare. American and British models had thicker armor, advanced optical sights, and efficient radio communication that allowed units to maneuver as one. Japanese tanks, by contrast, fought as isolated machines, relying on hand signals and prearranged plans. The Hago's 37mm gun could not penetrate the front armor of an M3 Stuart, let alone the M4 Sherman. Its 12mm side plates offered no defense against U.S. anti-tank weapons, even from long range. Its suspension, simple and lightweight, was too fragile for sustained combat in rough terrain. Yet perhaps its greatest weakness was industrial, not tactical. Japan lacked the steel production and heavy manufacturing capacity that powered the U.S. war machine. While American factories produced thousands of Shermans and Stuarts every month, Japan struggled to maintain even small-scale tank output. Each Hago was a compromise between military ambition and economic limitation. To American observers, this was stunning. They were used to a system that rewarded innovation, a cycle of constant improvement and adaptation. In the Pacific, captured Hago tanks became teaching tools for U.S. engineers. Reports from Guadalcanal in New Guinea described the tank as primitive, but ingeniously simple, a relic of an earlier war that had survived too long. By the time Japanese armor reached the islands, it was already obsolete, a 1930s Adi design trying to survive in a 1940s battlefield. That mismatch between technology and ambition would reach its breaking point. In the next phase of the war, when Japan's faith in light armor collided head-on with America's growing firepower, and that collision would come suddenly. In one violent night of fire and steel along the banks of the Tenarú River, August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal. The jungle was black under a moonless sky. The surf of the Lunga River, which the Marines called the Tenarú, broke softly against the sand. Along its banks, American machine gunners waited in silence, staring into the darkness. They could hear movement out there, faint clanking, gears grinding, the metallic cough of engines. Then, suddenly, they saw them. From the tree line emerged small shapes, tanks, moving in single file, headlights dimmed, their hulls glinting in the weak moonlight. The Type 95 Hagos of the Japanese First Company had begun their charge. Behind them, hundreds of infantry followed, shouting war cries that split the night air. The Marines held their fire until the tanks reached the sandbar in the middle of the river. Then, the quiet line of guns came alive. The first 37mm shell struck the lead tank just below the turret ring. It punched through effortlessly, igniting the ammunition inside. A yellow fireball lit up the entire riverbank. Within seconds, the second and third tanks were hit. Their thin armor peeled away like paper. Flames climbed high into the palm trees. Japanese infantry tried to rush forward behind the burning wrecks, but Marine machine guns tore through them. 30-caliber tracers streaked across the river, cutting down entire lines of men in seconds. The scene became a vision of chaos. Burning tanks, exploding fuel, shouting voices drowned by the roar of automatic fire. The Japanese attack, so meticulously planned, had collapsed into a massacre. By 3 a.m., all 9 Type 95s lay disabled or destroyed. The few that managed to reverse out of the line of fire bogged down in the wet sand or were finished off by grenades. At dawn, the battlefield was silent except for the crackle of burning oil. Bodies lay strewn across the riverbank. The Hagos, their turrets blown open, sat half-sunk in mud and ash. Marine engineers moved in cautiously, inspecting the wrecks. One man climbed atop a tank and dropped a spent cartridge against its armor. The sound echoed thin and hollow. Another bent down to examine a hole cleanly punched through the hull and shook his head. "You could do that with a wrench," he said quietly. For the Marines, the battle had proved one thing beyond doubt. Japan's tanks were no match for American firepower. But the real revelation would come hours later, when they opened the hatches and looked inside. As the sun climbed higher over the shattered palms, the smell of diesel and scorched paint hung thick in the humid air. Marines gathered around the wrecked Type 95s, curiosity overtaking the tension of battle. These were the first enemy tanks most of them had ever seen up close, and what they found inside would stay with them for the rest of the war. When the first hatch was pried open, a wave of heat and smoke escaped, carrying the acrid stench of burned rubber and oil. The interior was a tangled mess of melted wiring and jagged steel. The armor was so thin that daylight shone through the holes left by 37mm rounds. The rivets had popped loose from the shock, turning into deadly projectiles that had ricocheted within the compartment. Inside the driver's position, the Marines found nothing resembling the control systems of their own tanks. Just simple levers, crude gauges, and a bare metal seat bolted to the floor. The periscope was a narrow glass slit, clouded by soot. One Marine, an engineer by trade, muttered in disbelief, "I've seen tractors back home built better than this." At another wreck, a group of Marines carefully removed a small hand-painted flag from inside the turret. It bore the Japanese rising sun, covered in handwritten messages and signatures. The tank's commander had kept it folded against the armor wall. A good luck charm for a battle he never had a chance to win. In that moment, the mood shifted. The laughter faded into silence. The men realized that behind every flimsy panel and riveted plate had been human beings. Men who had fought and died in machines that could never protect them. U.S. intelligence officers soon arrived to document the find. They measured armor thickness, photographed the damage, and drafted technical notes that would later circulate through Marine Corps manuals. Their conclusion was precise and unemotional. Type 95 light tank. Poor armor protection. Inadequate firepower. Vulnerable to all U.S. anti-tank weapons. But for the Marines who had fought that night, the message was simpler and far more human. The Japanese tanks had been brave, but bravery could not stop a shell. That morning on Guadalcanal, the myth of Japanese invincibility burned out with those thin, smoldering tanks, and the United States had just learned something vital. In the Pacific, technology and industry would decide victory, not courage alone. The destruction of the Type 95s at the Tenarú was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological turning point. For the first time in the Pacific War, U.S. Marines had met a full Japanese armored assault and shattered it completely. The myth of Japan's unstoppable advance, which had gripped the world since 1941, began to crumble under the weight of American firepower and industrial might. In the days following the battle, reports from Guadalcanal circulated through U.S. commands. Technical officers analyzed every detail of the destroyed Hagos. They measured the penetration marks, cataloged fragments, and noted how even small-caliber weapons had punched through. The conclusion was immediate. Japan's tanks posed little threat to American armor, but they could still kill infantry if underestimated. Back in the United States, these findings influenced training and doctrine. Marines were taught to stand their ground against Japanese armor, to use discipline and coordination instead of fear. Every new unit heading to the Pacific studied photographs of the Hago, learning its weaknesses, the exposed fuel tanks, the thin turret ring, the vulnerable engine compartment. For Japan, the loss on Guadalcanal was sobering. The Type 95s had been sent with confidence, expected to terrify and crush the Americans. Instead, they became symbols of technological stagnation. Commanders in Tokyo received the battle reports with disbelief. Some officers proposed heavier tanks, but Japan's industrial limits made such plans impossible. The empire simply lacked the raw materials, steel capacity, and fuel reserves that powered America's growing war machine. On Guadalcanal, the Marines continued to fortify their lines, salvaging usable parts from the wrecks. Radio components, optics, even sections of track. To them, these burned-out tanks were not just trophies, but lessons written in steel. They had seen firsthand what American industry could do and what Japan could not. From that point forward, the balance of confidence shifted. Guadalcanal had proved that courage alone could not overcome machinery, and that America's way of war was just beginning to show its full strength. The defeat of the Type 95s on Guadalcanal sent quiet shockwaves through Japan's high command. Reports from the surviving infantry officers described scenes of disaster. Tanks destroyed within seconds, shells tearing through armor as if through paper, and entire crews lost before they could return fire. These were not isolated failures. They were symptoms of a doctrine trapped in the past. In Tokyo, engineers and officers debated what had gone wrong. Some argued for heavier designs, the Type 3 Chinu and Type 4 Chaito prototypes, but Japan's war economy could not sustain them. Aluminum and fuel were being diverted to the Air Force. Steel was scarce. Factories were under constant threat from American bombing. The Imperial Army continued to rely on existing light tanks, deploying them in increasingly desperate roles across the Pacific, from Saipan to Leyte, and later in suicidal ambushes during the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By contrast, the Americans were accelerating. The same year the Hago burned on Guadalcanal, Detroit was building M4 Shermans by the thousands. Improved optics, welded armor, stabilized guns. Each new batch of tanks was more refined than the last. What the Marines saw as crude wrecks in 1942 became valuable intelligence for an industrial giant that learned and adapted at lightning speed. Captured Type 95s were shipped to Hawaii and California for analysis. U.S. Army ordnance teams dismantled them piece by piece, documenting every weakness. Those reports circulated through training schools and manuals, reinforcing a lesson that would define the Pacific Campaign. America's strength was not just in courage, but in engineering. For the Japanese, the dream of mechanized warfare had ended in the mud of Guadalcanal. For the Americans, it had only begun. By early 1943, the United States no longer viewed Japanese armor as a threat, only as an opportunity to test, learn, and dominate. And from the shattered hull of one small tank, an empire's illusion of superiority had finally collapsed. The wrecked Type 95s at Guadalcanal came to symbolize far more than a failed Japanese assault. They were fragments of an old world, one built on faith in spirit and tradition, colliding with the new world of science, precision, and production. The Japanese tank crews who fought that night were not fools. They were brave men who trusted their training, their commanders, and their machines. But courage cannot bend steel, and discipline cannot thicken armor. When the Type 95 rolled into the crosshairs of a U.S. 30-70mm gun, the truth of modern war became undeniable. Technology had replaced valor as the final arbiter of survival. For the Americans, that realization became a quiet source of confidence. The Marines on Guadalcanal had seen what their country's factories could create. Weapons designed not for ceremony or show, but for endurance and victory. Behind every shell, every gun, every tank, was an industrial machine that stretched from Detroit to Pittsburgh, from Kansas to California. The Type 95 had met not just an enemy army. It had met the full momentum of American industry. In the years that followed, Japan would never catch up. Its engineers worked with brilliance, but without resources. Its soldiers fought with loyalty, but without protection. And as the war ground onward, the lessons of Guadalcanal echoed through every island, every beach, every burning vehicle. The Marines who had laughed at the tank's armor that morning were not mocking their enemy. They were witnessing history turning in real time. The light tank that once ruled Asia had become obsolete in a single night. When the smoke cleared, only one truth remained. In the Pacific, faith met steel, and steel endured.